All right, here we go. Power and authority. So I believe this is topic 1.5 in the course exam description if you're following along with the guided notes. If you're not, that's fine. I'm happy that you're here. So here we go. So power and authority is essentially comes down to how democratic and how authoritarian is a regime. Which of those characteristics is most prominent within a regime and controls who has power, who exercises power, how they exercise power, how is sovereignty used in a country. So democratic regimes can maintain sovereignty using typically less power than authoritarian regimes. Democratic sources of power and authority typically include rule of law. Like I said, that's a huge part of this course where nobody else is above the law. Everyone is held to the same standard in the legal system and is, judged fairly within the judicial system. That's what I was trying to go for. And there's also constitutions. That's a pretty big thing in democratic regimes. Now, Russia has a constitution. Does that mean it's a democratic regime? No, because it has more authoritarian characteristics than democratic characteristics. Particularly that its elections aren't free, fair, and competitive. But for the most part, democratic regimes are characterized by rule of law. That's actually pretty much a requirement to be a democratic regime. And then, for the most part, constitution or some other binding document is present within the political system. Now, in authoritarian regimes, their sources of power come from the military. That's pretty prominent. Religion, if they're a theocracy like Iran, dominant party like in China, and rule by law. As we discussed earlier, that's kind of the opposite of rule of law, and that's where typically like the government or the military are above the law. They're not held to the same standards, and they're treated unfairly compared to the average citizens. Maybe they're not being prosecuted, or if they are getting prosecuted, their punishment isn't as severe as it would have been for a regular citizen. So we're going to look at each of these countries individually, starting with the United Kingdom. So constitutional reforms in the United Kingdom have devolved power to multiple parliaments, and this allows the regime to maintain stability. So a little bit of background information. So the United Kingdom, as we know earlier, is separated into 4 regions: England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. As a result of what's called devolution, they have devolved power to parliaments within these regions. So there is a Scottish parliament and an English parliament. There's also a federal parliament. That's very important. And that has allowed the regime to maintain stability because the desires of the people within these specific regions are being met by these regional parliaments. So these are sources of power within each region. So the Wales parliament can't pass a law that's applied to the Scottish entity because the Scottish parliament would have to approve it and pass it themselves. Since 1997, the House of Commons, which is a house in their legislature, has increasingly devolved local governing powers to these regional parliaments. So this is a very contemporary process that the regions are very, very happy with. The power rests entirely, the rest of the power essentially rests entirely in the Prime Minister and then the national parliament. So the House of Commons is part of that national parliament that I was discussing. The Prime Minister, who is their head of government, holds the other power. And the power is kind of fused, as we said earlier, between the Prime Minister and the Parliament. The Parliament actually picks the Prime Minister. The monarch, who is the head of state, has really no decision-making power. We'll learn later that head of state, which is what Charlie essentially is more of a ceremonial role. And they might have some power over foreign policy and diplomatic relations, but that's about it. And the monarchy used to have a lot of power. When I think of the UK monarchy, I sometimes go back to King George III and the American Revolution. And during that time, the king had lots of say in what processes happened in England and colonial America and their other colonized territory. Now, the House of Commons has passed various legislations within the past hundreds of years that have severely limited the power of the monarchy. So traditionally, yeah, they had a lot of power, but nowadays, well, not so much. Now, they do have a constitution. Let's talk about a constitution. Then we'll talk about the UK's constitution. It's a little different. So a constitution in itself is a set of rules and principles established on principles or precedents that a state must abide by. So it's a set of rules based on other rules or principles, like the United States Constitution. There's a set of rules of separation of powers based off the principles of separation of powers that Montesquieu laid out. So that's just an example for you. Now, the UK doesn't have a codified constitution, so it doesn't have one that they written down. They didn't have any founding fathers back in the day that wrote a constitution at a constitutional convention. However, there are various constitutional principles and statutes that the political system, particularly the Supreme Court, abides by, and this is called common law. So we would say the UK has an unwritten constitution. And we have parliamentary sovereignty as the supreme source of law because the parliament passed the law. And since we have rule of law, the king is under law. So these are examples of these constitutional principles. Rule of law, particularly, is a very prominent one in our democratic regimes. We also have that adult citizens exhibit universal suffrage in elections. I also want to point out, because you may see this on the AP exam, is that these elections are for the legislator. They're not for the prime minister. They're also not for the monarchy. But I think most people know that the monarchy is part of the royal family. And then the Constitution is bound to international law, as Parliament has chosen to increase its practical power in cooperation with other countries via international organizations. So we know that the United Kingdom used to be part of the European Union. That's no longer the case, but there's other organizations that the United Kingdom is a part of. So this unwritten Constitution also applies to the international law and the standards that other countries expect from the United Kingdom as part of their relationships. All right, let's move into China, which is very different from the United Kingdom. I love these memes. All the best memes are the ones that relate to China. So the Chinese Communist Party's control over China's military. So they control China's military. It makes sense, and that's provided power and authority to maintain regime stability. Because essentially, if you got protests and stuff, the Communist Party could just send out the military, and there goes all your protests and your opposition. The Communist Party's Liberation Army won a civil war in 1949, in which this guy, I don't know how to say it, Mao Zedong, emerged as the revolutionary leader of the People's Republic of China. So he was a leader with power and authority, and this was derived from that civil war in 1949. Because typically when someone wins a civil war, they become a very big power holder in the country. Today, the General Secretary of the Communist Party is also designated as the chair of the China's Central Military Commission. So this seat gives them a lot of power because they're head of that military, which, as we said earlier, provides a lot of power and authority to the country. So it's all kind of fusing together. Okay, now let's look into Iran's sources of power and authority. So the transition of power from dictatorial rule in Iran, which used to be the case, I believe it's, till 79, to a religious theocracy based on Islamic law, occurred after a revolution in 1979. I read a book once in 6th grade. It's called It Ain't So Awful Falafel. I guess it's considered historical fiction. It's not a real story, but it's about a family that moved to America from Iran. And while they were living there, they were given all this news about the revolution while they were trying to, assimilate into American life. And they were also hearing all this about their homeland and their family who still lived there. It was a very interesting novel. There was also the religious establishment after this revolution, and then that helps shape public opinion and provides guidance on matters of morality and law. And this occurs because law and morality within the political system and the citizens is based upon Islam. So laws can't be passed if they violate Islamic law. And we call this Sharia law a lot, Shari. I have it up on the screen on the second line here. This is something that you'll see on the AP exam. I might refer to it as that. So it's called Sharia law. And then the supreme leader of Iran, who is not elected by the people, is the highest ranking political and religious authority. I don't know why I have a line break here, but the supreme leader has the final say on major political, military, and foreign policy matters. And this position is held by a cleric who is appointed, not elected, by the Assembly of Experts, which is a body of Islamic scholars. So the supreme leader obviously has to be Muslim, and the Islamic scholars that elect him in the Assembly of Experts are going to definitely make sure of this, make sure he's very well taught and understood of theology, as well as may have some, not experience, but dedication to the role as supreme leader, this political role. So it's a religious and a political role, because they are a cleric, which is very religious, but they also are the highest ranking political official, so that's in a political authority. right, let's look at the sources of power in Mexico. So Mexico also had a revolution, and this was before 1979. So after the Mexican Revolution, the government created by Mexico's 1917 constitution was dominated by a single party. And this was the Institutional Revolutionary Party, which is the PRI. I think we discussed it earlier. The Institutional Revolutionary Party, as I said, allowed opposing parties to win some legislative elections. So they weren't as dominant. They're not like the Communist Party where they're like, nope, get out of here. You're stupid. You're dumb. But for the most part, they had control over the political system for about 71 years. The government is the most powerful figure in Mexico's government, and they were, of course, for 71 years part of the PRI party, and they didn't lose a presidential election until a rival party, the National Action Party, came about and won an election in 2000. Now, by 2018, 3 different parties had won power with elected presidents and plus majority control of the national legislature. So even though that the National Action Party won the presidential election in 2000, that doesn't mean that PRI maintained control of the legislature since then. No, there's been various parties that have won majority control of the national legislature since 2000. It's kind of gone back and forth a little bit, if you want to look into that. And let's look into Nigeria. So after independence from British colonization, which they were colonized as a result of the Berlin Conference, if you're familiar with that, they gained their independence in 1963. Nigeria struggled to consolidate power in democratically elected leaders. They were struggling to be a standalone country, which it makes sense. It's hard going from all this authority from a different source to being out on your own. There's that song in Hamilton, the last King George III song. It's like, you're on your own. No, that's the second song, not the third one. The second song is like, you're on your own. Awesome. Wow. And you're like, you're going to fail. You suck. That's essentially kind of what was happening in Nigeria. They were kind of sucking. They were kind of failing. They weren't doing that good. There were repeated coups, which is kind of just an overthrow of the political system, typically very violent, and they've resulted in 2 extended periods of military rule until the ratification of Nigeria's current constitution. So kind of like Mexico, there was a revolution, not really a revolution, but there was a constitution established after a very more authoritarian side of government. They didn't have coups in Mexico. For this course, I believe Nigeria is the only one with prominent coups that we talk about. So yeah, the first peaceful transfer of power is very, very recent. From one elected president to another occurred in 2007. Nigeria's first peaceful transfer of power from a president of one party to a president of a rival party occurred in 2015. And as we can see here, these are our 2 parties. We have the People's Democratic Party and the All Progressives Congress, I believe is what the party is. And let's look at Russia. So historically, Russia was an autocratic nation ruled by a Tsar. That's no longer the case. In 1919, they turned into a dictatorship under the Communist Party, and that's where the Soviet Union kind of came about. So in 1991, the Soviet Union broke apart, and Russia reemerged as a sovereign nation. However, the years of communist rule did not disappear. They did not just disintegrate because Russia was Russia again. There were some movements towards democratization and democracy in Russia under Boris Yeltsin, particularly with the implementation of the election processes. But when Vladimir Putin became Russia's president in 1999, he kind of took a step back. During that time, there were dozens of parties elected to a very highly fractured national legislature. But within 8 years of his first 2 terms as president, Putin helped create United Russia, which is the dominant party in Russia. It's not the only party in Russia, unlike China, but it's certainly the most prominent one, and really the only one with any political power, for that matter. 3 other parties have consistently won legislative elections since then. Not all of them, some legislative elections. That's pretty important to point out. You don't want to mess with Putin in the United Russia party. So this is very similar to the PRI's dominance in Mexico. None of these parties have actually rivaled United Russia for power. United Russia is kind of a boot on an ant. So here, I kind of show you what I'm talking about. So, like, this is from, what is this, 2020? Yeah, this is one of their legislative houses in Congress. Let me drink some water real quick. So we can see here that United Russia has a pretty strong hold on this house of the legislature, and the Communist Party still hasn't disintegrated entirely. And we can see here that we have 2 other parties that are kind of in here. 3 other parties, sorry, New People, that's the third one. as well. So 3 other parties that are kind of winning those legislative elections, but their representation is very minimal. I mean, 5% is not that much for seats inside of a Congress chamber. And now we're going to look at changes in power and authorities. We talked about the sources. Now we're going to look at the changes and how they've changed over time. We kind of did already, but I made something kind of cool, which I'll show you. So changes in regimes occur when rules and institutions are replaced either incrementally, so that means in stages, or suddenly, all at once, zip, zap, bobbity boo, in which a large portion of the population supports a change in the political system. So when I talk about Nigeria and the coups, the people overthrew the power, essentially. And then the military dictatorship came in, or was already there. Because remember, I said there was 2 extended periods of time. So governments, including political office holders, so your representatives, your presidents, that sort of thing, can be changed more frequently. It's pretty easy to change a government compared to a regime. It's not easy, but it's easier. And this is typically more peaceful, and this is due to like elections. So I can change the government through an election because I can elect someone else. Kind of crazy. We can change the majority party through an election, and we can appoint a different president in the United States, or the United Kingdom can appoint a different prime minister. And there's also lines of succession. So if we have someone die, that line of succession, if the next office holder who's going to become that president is a different party, which never happens, then that government would change. That's not really that frequent, though. Now, governments also can change by more violent means, such as revolutions or coups, and this is particular in Iran and Nigeria. That revolution in 1979 was very, very violent. I strongly recommend looking into it. You don't have to know that much about it for this course. You really don't know anything about it for this course. You just need to know that Iran had a revolution, but it's very interesting. Now, Jerry here says that regimes always transform from authoritarian to democratic, and that is just not true. In this course, they really do. They really only go from authoritarian to democratic. However, they can go from democratic to authoritarian if they put in an authoritarian characteristic. So if a country starts having unfair, uncompetitive, unreliable elections, they're transferring back to an authoritarian regime. If the government takes hold of all the media in the country, they're transferring back to an authoritarian regime. If they're restricting your civil rights and civil liberties, that's not democratic. They're going back to an authoritarian regime. If they're telling you, oh, you have to buy bread at this date, that's not democratic. If they're telling you you can only visit these websites at a time, or you have to pay to access YouTube or something, that's not democratic. That's very, very, very authoritarian of the government. And like I said earlier, the more that the government does, the more likely it is to be authoritarian, because authoritarian governments typically have more power than a democratic government. Now, here's the really cool thing I was talking about. It is a summary table, and you're welcome if you want to draw this table. You can. It's really, really helpful, and it really shows the comparisons between these countries, like Mexico, Iran, China, revolutions, Mexico, Iran, China, Nigeria, Russia, constitutions. Now, the United Kingdom has tradition as one, which is because they don't have a constitution. Magna Carta is a document that was created in 1215 that outlines a lot of political principles. And there's other documents since then that have set that common law, as I was talking about earlier, where the legislative and judicial systems kind of follow by in their principles. And we can see here that China's operated by a dominant party. Iran's had the implementation of Sharia law, which is just Muslim law. And Russia's dominated by the United Russia Party. Thanks so much for watching. Please like and subscribe. It's free, which means it costs $0. And it really does help me out. Leave a comment down below with any questions. I'll be happy to answer them. There's some links down below in the description with practice tests, key terms, guided notes, all that fun stuff. Head on over to the next AP Comparative video on some really cool political stuff.